Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and joining me today is Paul Pryce, principal advisor to the Consul General of Japan in Calgary and a former senior research fellow for the Atlantic Council of Canada's Maritime Nation program. Hello, Paul, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on here, David. And I really hope you and yours are staying safe and well during these especially uncertain times.
Thank you very much, and you're welcome. We are speaking on Thursday, June 4, a few days after the Center for International Maritime Security, or CIMSEC, published your article on the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, along with the Marmara Sea, which are collectively known as the Turkish Straits and provide sole access to the Black Sea from the Mediterranean and Aegean seas. Let me just say at the outset that I'm no maritime expert, so Paul, I hope you'll be gentle if I confuse any terms or make an error.
Of course, no problem at all.
So as you write, more than 41,000 vessels passed through the Turkish Straits last year, carrying 650 million tons of cargo, which makes them one of the world's most important trade corridors. The Montreux Convention of 1936 ensures Turkey's control over the straits while guaranteeing free passage of civilian vessels in peacetime and restricting the passage of naval ships not belonging to littoral Black Sea states, which, in addition to Turkey, are from west to east, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Russia, and Georgia. In your article, you argue that recent calls from Turkey and Russia to revise the convention threaten to spur a Black Sea arms race or exploit the Turkish Straits as a strategic choke point. Please, Paul, if you would tell us a bit about these suggested revisions. Let's start with those of Russia and President Vladimir Putin.
Sure, of course. So in the case of the Montreux Convention, this one was established kind of 1936. A lot of uncertainty at that time because some players had thought to change the situation regarding the Turkish Straits after the liberation of the Turkish Republic. So the British, for example, in 1922 had tried to take control of the Dardanelles, thinking that would give them, free access. They could do whatever they wanted. So the convention, as you mentioned, was sort of a way of ensuring everyone felt safe and comfortable that they'd get what they want out of the use of the Turkish Straits, that no one was going to perpetrate another war for control of the Straits that would cost human lives, but also there wouldn't be, some unilateral action by Turkey like Abdel Nasser, decades later nationalizing the Suez Canal and potentially constraining the flow of trade between, in the case of the Turkish Straits, the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. So one of the requirements that are set out in the Montreux Convention is that other countries that are not bordering the Black Sea allow or inform Turkey in advance, sometimes several weeks in advance, of the movement of military vessels through. And they're also limited in the number of vessels they can send through, the kind, and how long they can stay. So, for example, in the case of the United States, they can't put, an aircraft carrier in the Black Sea and park it there to put pressure on Russia. It would have to be smaller vessels and, as I say, limited to maybe a 21-day stay. But with a lot of the issues that have sprung up since the annexation of Crimea by Russia, NATO has been increasing its presence in the Black Sea. The US occasionally placing vessels nearby just to provide, I suppose, some support to Ukraine, but also to NATO members within the region like Bulgaria, Romania, and also Turkey. But Russia is concerned that maybe this is a buildup of military presence, that the United States is going to try to do something to take Crimea back by force and give it to Ukraine. So they've been proposing, why don't we reform the Montreux Convention so that there's even tighter restrictions, that you're limited to a 14-day stay, for example, in the Black Sea if you're a non-littoral state. So that's sparked a fair bit of concern and controversy on the two sides. There are some...
So wait, just to clarify, the idea from the Russian side is that altering the Montreux Convention in this way would thus curb or limit NATO or Western intervention in terms of what it's doing in regards to Ukraine and Crimea. Is that right?
Absolutely correct, yes. But at
Okay.
the same time, it's interesting where Russia seems to be undermining the Montreux Convention to some extent, where they've been creatively interpreting the document and saying, no, it doesn't require us to seek Turkish consent if we're moving our vessels through the Turkish Straits. We just have to give you prior notice. So there were some odd comments from a Russian vice admiral, for example, last year saying, well, historically the Black Sea was a Russian lake, and so it's none of Turkey's business what we put into the Black Sea and what we take out, which is a bit of a provocative gesture.
Right, particularly as there are several countries that have territory on the Black Sea. As you said, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, which sparked a conflict with neighboring Ukraine that continues to this day at a low intensity in its eastern Donbass region. Shouldn't this conflict void the Montreal Convention's peacetime allowances and give Turkey greater control over which vessels can pass through? That would seem particularly fitting because Russia has taken control of the Kerch Strait, which skirts Crimea and provides sole access to the Sea of Azov, which is home to key Ukrainian ports like Mariupol.
But it's interesting where Turkey hasn't really taken a explicit position in terms of the Montreux Convention, aside from saying maybe that things should be a little bit more robust in terms of the controls and the prior notice, not just for military traffic, but also civilian commercial traffic. There's entire web pages on the Turkish Foreign Ministry's website basically describing the volume of hazardous cargo that passes through the straits every day. Basically calling it sort of a ticking time bomb, so to speak, that if anything were to occur with an oil tanker or a natural gas tanker that's passing through the straits, there's 22 million people, Turkish nationals who are living along the coasts, both banks of the Turkish Straits. And so there's some commentary there, but when it comes to Crimea, there's a deafening silence, I suppose. And maybe
Why do you think that is?
I think maybe it's a part of just Turkish foreign policy since the liberation of the Turkish Republic, where just avoiding conflict with Russia, maybe even to some extent appeasing Russia. And that maybe is just because over the course of the 1700s and 1800s, there were many, many conflicts fought between Russia and Turkey, which had cost many lives and also resulted in the loss of territory that had belonged to the Ottoman Empire at the time. So these wars led to the independence of Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, the Bessarabia as well, which is now mainly Moldova and parts of Western Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea the first time around by the Russians. So maybe there's a feeling of whenever there's a war that occurs within the Black Sea, one way or the other, it's a tragic loss of life, and maybe we need to be focusing our resources in other directions. Sure, of course, there are mountain ranges on the eastern border of Turkey that limit Iran's capacity to cause trouble, but still you have the instability to the south in Syria. There's the Iraqi question that continues onwards, the perceived threat, at least from the West, from Greece. And so why not make sure that you're limiting the number of conflicts that you're fighting, limit the number of fronts. So perhaps that's why we've had this policy of let's just live and let live when it comes to Russia's activities on the other side of the Black Sea. I'm not entirely sure that's a wise policy because, of course, Russia has been vastly expanding its hold on the Black Sea, and Turkey still has what it has. There's no expansion of Turkish presence or Turkish control over the Black Sea. So at a certain point, you have to say, hey, this is getting a little uncomfortable, guys.
But has there been any effort that you know of on the part of the US or NATO or Europe to put pressure on Turkey to kind of void the Montreal Convention's peacetime allowances and hand Turkey greater control over the straits?
Not necessarily. There has been some commentary from some Americans that, oh, well, our policy has always been freedom of transit and freedom of passage. So why does Turkey have these special allowances under the Montreux Convention? We've seen the American Navy conducting things called freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, in the South China Sea to challenge China's territorial claims. I'm a Canadian, and so we have our own issues as well with the Americans over the Northwest Passage, where they'll occasionally talk about putting something through to show that they don't recognize our claims over some sections of the Arctic. So some have talked about doing that in relation to the Turkish Straits. Fortunately, they're in the minority. I think the majority of the American defense establishment understands that the Montreux Convention is the best possible deal, that if there were to be any effort to challenge Turkey's sovereignty over the Turkish Straits, it wouldn't go well. That there's a significant Turkish naval presence very close by. There's more skin in the game for Turkey than the United States. This is an academic exercise for the Americans to do a phone up through the Straits. As I mentioned, there's 22 million Turkish citizens living on the banks of these straits. So, of course, there's going to be a pretty significant pushback if you were to try and do anything to alter the legal or strategic situation of the straits.
In the article, you say that Turkey sees its control of the Turkish Straits as crucial to its maritime might and key to its Asian-European duality and to its place as sort of guardian of the Black Sea. You also point out that because the Marmara is an internal sea bordered on all sides by Turkish territory, any reshaping of the Montreux Convention could result in the Turkish Straits being seen not as a single entity, but as three distinct waterways and particularly two separate straits, one enabling outside access to Turkish waters and another providing access from Turkish waters to the Black Sea. Do I have that correct? And how might such an alteration reshape the regional maritime situation?
Absolutely, yeah. It's the straits are unusual because of that kind of three component that you mentioned. So even grammatically in English, do we say the Turkish Straits is or the Turkish Straits are? It's
Yes,
kind of
yes.
an interesting challenge. So as you mentioned, if the Montreux Convention were to be just taken away tomorrow, you might be able to get through the Dardanelles and you might be able to get through the Bosporus, but you've got the Sea of Marmara in between, and so you've actually got less access by challenging the current legal order. If you're a country that wants to mess with that legal order, like some of those Americans who had proposed just doing away with the Montreux Convention. So if that were to be the case, then we'd see a very significant challenge when it comes to the flow of global trade through the straits, because of course the uncertainty of whether or not you'd actually get permission to pass through. Obviously, this would escalate tensions between Turkey and Russia, even if Russia wasn't one of the players that undermined the Montreux Convention in this hypothetical scenario, because a lot of that hazardous cargo that's passing through the straits that Turkey has expressed concerns about is Russian oil and Russian natural gas. So that's particularly concerning when it comes to the potential for an escalating conflict if the Montreux Convention were done away with. I suppose the biggest underlying issue here is a lack of trust, perhaps, among the many different players, and perhaps that really needs to be the focus of diplomatic efforts in the future, is to enhance that trust among players.
Just to make it clear for our listeners, the passage from north to south would go Black Sea, Bosporus Strait, Marmara Sea, Dardanelles Strait, and then to the Aegean. But what chance is there of that happening, of the Montreux Convention being done away with and some new kind of permissions and regulations being put in place? Are there countries pressing for that, and is one of them Turkey?
There is a concern, as you mentioned, that the Istanbul Canal could actually wind up undermining the Montreux Convention. So when the project was kind of first proposed, this idea of the so-called crazy canal was that Ekrem Yildirim had said that basically the Montreux Convention wouldn't apply to the Istanbul Canal, that this is almost an express lane between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea, and so none of it applies, and basically Turkey could apply whatever rules it wants to the Istanbul Canal. And
Well,
if you have,
before you go into that, let me just give a little info on that for our listeners.
sure.
It's one of Erdogan's pet mega projects that he himself has called a crazy project. It's a 45-kilometer, perhaps $25 billion waterway, still to be built. Hasn't begun yet. To be built from the Marmara to the Black Sea, parallel to the Bosphorus, some 20 kilometers to the west. The Turkish government argues that the new canal would reduce congestion and accidents on the Bosphorus, but Turkish freighter captains, as you mentioned in your article, have pointed out that it would be too shallow for most of the tankers that transit the Bosphorus, while environmentalists argue that the new canal would destroy the fragile Black Sea ecosystem and potentially taint the groundwater. Okay, so please, sorry,
Oh,
continue.
sure, of course, yeah, absolutely. No, and thank you for giving a bit of that background. Yeah, that's one of the uh, concerns is that could upend the order, especially because, as you mentioned, the concerns about the hazardous cargo and so on through the straits. If you had the Istanbul Canal established, maybe Turkey could turn around, renounce the Montreux Convention, and say, "But it's okay, guys, because you no longer need to pass your hazardous cargo through the straits. You can do it through the canal, and it will be safer." And maybe provide some moral justification for changing the legal order there. But nonetheless, it essentially gives Turkey a chokehold on access between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. So any future NATO operations, for example, in the Black Sea, would be entirely vetoed, or could be potentially vetoed by Turkey if they decided they didn't like what was being done in the Black Sea. So
Right, and how do you imagine NATO and, say, Russia would respond to this?
I think they would be supremely upset. I think it would place Turkey in a very awkward position. I think there was a fair bit of miscalculation when it came to the canal project, and so it does make one wonder if this wasn't necessarily a well-conceived geopolitical initiative by Erdogan and his government, but instead just a way of messing with real estate, and maybe there's some financial incentives when it comes to introducing this project, just because, as mentioned, when Harriet had surveyed freighter captains, they had said that the draft is too shallow. It's not going to be possible to accommodate a lot of the heavier cargoes. So even when there are these claims being made, the canal will allow us to move hazardous cargo through safer areas, it's not a legitimate argument. It makes for good window dressing for what you're attempting to do, but that's clearly not the underlying intention.
Wait,
And
are you saying that the government is attempting mainly to kind of boost real estate prices in the area and not really planning to build this canal? Or are you saying that the main idea behind the canal is to kind of avoid the Montreux Convention and gain greater control over these waterways?
I think, honestly, it might be a bit more of the former, and it's a matter of gaming real estate prices ultimately. I don't see this as a worthwhile geopolitical initiative, and certainly not worth the amount of investment that's been conceived for the project. It's unfortunate that this is being put forward and dressed up as a way of improving the safety and security of people living in the Straits.
Yeah, but I mean, Turkey is making all signs that it's going forward with it. The government held the project's first tender in March, though the minister who handled it was fired soon after. It was a clear sign of progress for a controversial and long gestating project. Let's say the canal is built. Like, how might Turkey be able to use it to truly threaten the Montreux Convention? Couldn't tankers just continue to transit freely through the Bosphorus rather than, say, paying fees to Turkish authorities to go through the new canal?
Well, there is, of course, the legal precedent that Turkey can, restrict travel through the Bosporus and levy customs and duties on cargoes that are being passed through. But then, of course, as well, you have the force there available to change realities on the ground that it's one thing to say, well, I'm not going to listen to what you're going to say, and it's another thing when that person has a frigate or a Coast Guard cutter parked up beside you with guns trained on you, so to speak. So one way or the other, there is that capacity to ensure that Turkish laws are being abided by any commercial traffic that passes through. It becomes a lot more contentious if one tries to do that with military traffic flowing through, especially when states would say, well, but the Montreux Convention still applies. Of course, if Turkey does renounce the Montreux Convention, that doesn't necessarily mean we're now left with no international laws applying to this particular region. It means that basically when one of the parties, such as Turkey, renounces the convention, then the various parties to the agreement are required to hold a conference and to discuss whether or not they should adapt anything within the convention that would address that particular state's concerns. Of course, Turkey could still be obstructionist when it comes to those sorts of talks and not support a renewal or a kind of Montreux Convention 2.0. But of course, that would just sort of add to the political pressure being placed on Turkey at that point and turn international public opinion perhaps against him. I don't know if necessarily the hazardous cargo argument would be able to see them through that entire diplomatic crisis.
It sounds like you're saying that if the canal were to be built, we could see someday in the future a Turkish military vessel facing off with hoped to be transiting, say, Russian military vessel off the coast of Istanbul.
It's entirely possible, yes, yeah, and it's hopefully something that we can all work to avoid.
There's also a domestic political aspect to this, as you point out in the article. Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is seen as a rising star in Turkish politics and a potential threat to Erdogan in the 2023 presidential vote, or at least planned for 2023 right now. He has voiced his strong opposition to the canal and appears to have public support on his side. Could this impact whether the canal is built?
Yes, yeah, it could entirely ensure that it doesn't get built. Ekrem İmamoğlu, he's come out in opposition to the project, and so if there were to be some sort of change in government, then it might be possible. Of course, the question is whether or not that change in government would happen before shovels are in the ground. Once things have been torn up and neighborhoods displaced, it's hard to go back on it. I'm not entirely sure what could be done in that situation if you had the canal 10% built, 50% built, when there were to be a change in government, if a change in government were to even take place.
Russia and Turkey are already at odds in Syria and in Libya, where they have been providing military support to opposing sides. And a report just out this week found that in the last 2 months, Turkey has been importing more gas from Azerbaijan than from Russia, despite the two launching the 7.8 billion Turk Stream pipeline in January. I wonder, do you see these Turkish Straits issues further increasing tensions between Ankara and Moscow? In the article, you outline a diplomatic resolution to this budding crisis via the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE.
Yes, yeah. So I think there is that potential for ever-increasing tensions there. There are so many conflict points between Ankara and Moscow right now. You mentioned Turk Stream. There's also, the Russian support for Haftar in Libya. So many particular points on which Ankara and Moscow diverge in their understanding. But as you mentioned, because both Russia and Turkey are members of the OSCE, perhaps that could be a good platform for de-escalating those tensions and building that trust I spoke about earlier. So within the OSCE, there's something called the Vienna document, which sets out a few different ideas or measures on how participating states can reduce their tensions. So sometimes, for example, if one country is going to host large-scale military exercises just across the border from another country, then you would invite officers from that other country to observe the exercise just to ease any tensions or concerns that they might have that this is about basically sending in an invasion or something like that, that this is just an exercise and not an excuse to walk across the border. Mutual basic inspections, for example, just to see, if you're not hiding anything there as a precursor to an invasion. So these kinds of measures have worked to ease tensions between some countries in the past, and such as between Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. And so it could be something done to ease some of the tensions between the various Black Sea littoral states that, you're not planning on doing anything that would change the legal order or strategic order around the Black Sea.
The counter to that is, of course, the diplomat suggests diplomacy. How well has that worked in regards to Turkey's meddling in the Eastern Mediterranean, let's say, or for ending the war in Libya, which European leaders have tried to do? Diplomacy in those cases only seems to have brought in more players and created more frustration. To the pessimist, it can often seem like diplomacy is a way of just kicking the can down the road, which in the end often enables bullies like Putin and Erdogan to get their way.
Yeah, that's true. I being a diplomatic aide myself, I can understand that's a valid criticism against what I've proposed. And even in the case of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, which it was an even more robust form of that Vienna document, Russia had basically just torn that document up and left the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty just basically as the war in Georgia had broke out in 2008. So it's a valid argument. I would say that perhaps a shared self-interest would help ensure some adherence to this, that I think Moscow would be deluding itself to think that any conflict with Turkey would be a cakewalk, that, basically seizing greater control of the Black Sea is no problem at all, given the fact that they've had difficulty even taking control over Mariupol in the southeast of Ukraine. Kind of indicates, I think, to the Russians that you can't really push much further in the near future. And so if we're going to have to live together, then let's find a way to do so successfully. So I think that self-interest of, I don't want to fight you and you don't want to fight me, so why don't we talk about avoiding this dance between this situation where we never have full peace or full war, where we're always in this halfway point between war and peace. So I think there might be some shared interest that would allow for the political will and lead to some kind of Vienna Document Plus for the Black Sea.
Speaking of shared interests, Fayez al-Sarraj, the leader of the Tripoli-based Government of National Accord, or GNA, is meeting Turkish President Erdogan in Ankara today. I wonder if you might give us your thoughts on Turkey's recent maritime borders deal with the GNA, which hands Turkey vastly more maritime territory than it had before and essentially erases the Greek island of Crete off the map. Legal experts generally agree that it's not binding, this deal, and the U.S. has described it as a provocation, particularly for nearby states like Cyprus and Greece. So why then do you think Turkey made the deal? Is it mainly a negotiating ploy? And if so, has this sort of tactic worked before?
Well, I do wonder if perhaps for Erdogan it's maybe to some degree a domestic political gesture of showing there was something won from the sacrifices that have been made in Libya, that maybe there's a need to attach some strings now to Turkey's increased military exploits overseas, now that we have a Turkish military presence as well in Somalia to support the development of Somalia's military. And of course, as you mentioned, Turkey's engagement in Syria. So you have all these adventures overseas, and maybe all you get on occasion is bills and body bags coming back. So there'd be a desire to have some kind of value extracted from these engagements. One could maybe argue that there's a moral value that's extracted from supporting a particular government against maybe a threat that's perceived as illegitimate or terroristic, but that moral value only takes you so far when it comes to public support for military expeditions. So perhaps this economic incentive is something that you can bring home to the voter, so to speak. But as you mentioned, I'm a little skeptical on the legal standing of this particular deal. It does go against a few principles within the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and as you mentioned, erases Crete from the map, ignores potential overlap with Cyprus's exclusive economic zone, and so on. So it's difficult to see how it could be successfully implemented, and even when it would come to some sort of offshore oil or gas project on the coast of Libya, the logistics are very uncertain. So I'm not sure this could just be sort of a mirage of economic benefit.
Turkey has been drilling off the coast of Cyprus for the past year or so, which the Republic of Cyprus and the European Union have said is illegal. Now, just this week, Turkish officials said they plan to fulfill this controversial maritime deal and start drilling off the coast of Libya in the next few months. How do you see that playing out?
I'm really not sure that it could be done at this stage. I know a lot of success has been made in the fight against Haftar, but there's still a lot of instability within Libya. Of course, if it's far enough away from any kind of population center, then maybe you could successfully conduct an offshore oil and gas oil or gas operation. But I think it's a little too soon to say the war is won in Libya. Let's get in there with our investment and our boots and our shovels and start doing stuff. It's a little too soon, in my opinion.
A bit of hopeful thinking on the part of Turkey, you're saying?
Hopeful thinking, yes, absolutely. And as I say, I need to really show very quickly to the voter that this was for something. And of course, maybe as well to show to other players on the international stage that that we've carved our sphere of influence, that this is ours, and be cautious about how you pursue a post-conflict Libya.
Paul Pryce, maritime analyst and principal advisor to the Consul General of Japan in Calgary. Thanks again. Thanks so much for your time and insight. It's been a pleasure chatting.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.